This podcast is giving me the opportunity to sort of explain how I came to the conclusion of I should vote for Trump in 2020.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Big Thoughts, Little Talks. In this episode, I talk with a good friend of mine who is planning to vote for Donald Trump in the upcoming election. There is no video, and I won't be sharing the identity of my guest due to the sensitive nature of the topic. However, she did agree to let her voice be included, unedited, which means that some of you mutual friends out there may recognize it. And if that's the case, we just ask that you respect her wishes of maintaining a level of anonymity and to not tag her or identify her in comments or posts. That being said, this conversation was a broad and open-ended one that lasted almost 3 hours over 2 separate Zoom calls. And for the sake of clarity, I've decided to break this up into 3 parts. In the first part, which you're listening to now, we actually talk very little about politics and Trump, and instead spend most of the time setting the stage, discussing the fundamental truths, morals, and values that serve as the foundation for her beliefs and ultimately her decision to vote for Donald Trump. So just wanted to set those expectations that this part is not a political discussion yet, but one where we talk about philosophy and search for common ground from which we can eventually build up our arguments in the next episodes. And I hope that if you're listening to this episode, you are able to approach it with an open mind and a willingness to understand a different point of view. So without further ado, here's my conversation with a Donald Trump supporter. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I've been really excited for this, and also feeling very, very grateful to you, for the opportunity. Both just for our friendship, but then also, of course, for the wider, Peter Ian fan club.
Hopefully to be. But yeah, so to give listeners a bit of background, I posted a Facebook post a few weeks ago asking if there were any of my friends who were planning to vote Republican for this upcoming election. And my goal was really it sprung out of this observation that social media was becoming a very, and our country in general is just becoming a very polarizing place. And it seems like the ability to have conversations with people that we might disagree with is diminishing. And that's something that I was really worried about. I am someone who traditionally votes Democrat. I plan to vote for Joe Biden this year, so I wanted to talk to someone who had the opposing views, because I just didn't really see that on my newsfeed. I saw a lot of anti-Donald Trump posts, but I didn't see the other one and the other side of it, the matter. So you reached out to me, you sent me a message, and I'm really grateful you reached out. And and so now we're having this conversation. And I think the goal is to just try to understand each other's point of view, and also challenge each other. I think that, the great thing about the fact that we have this friendship is that we have some assumption of goodwill towards each other. So hopefully we can have a good-hearted conversation that challenges both of us.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more with you about the sort of feeling a little bit dismayed at the lack of dialogue that is happening. And I think, part of it, the things that really make me sad on social media, I think social media is not the best forum at all for politics in general, because politics are usually a very inflammatory subject, and it's so much easier to be compassionate and to be able to assume the goodwill, like you were saying, assume the goodwill of another when you are, you can see them face to face. So for everyone who's listening right now, Peter and I are on a Zoom where we can see each other. But I am not going to post my face or my name, partly so that to protect my family from any. Unfortunately, there have been some instances where people have suffered like job losses or anything like that, and I don't want to risk that for anyone in my family or me. So I'm staying anonymous, and if any of our mutual friends recognize my voice, I ask them to, like Peter, to respect, out of respect for our friendship, to respect that anonymity. So I'm really excited. Number one, I'm really excited to do this because this gives me a chance to, number one, get to know you, Peter, and get to hear your opinions and your views, and also have the opportunity to voice mine and be heard and not feel like I'm gonna get canceled.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So where do you want to start?
Yes.
Okay.
So, okay, let's set the stage. We are like rewind a few years, a few more than I would wish.
Okay.
We're back in college, and it's like a Friday night. We're a few beers in, and we're just having one of those nice, deep conversations that you have in college. Like you're just talking about life, and like it's getting real, man. And you're just throwing stuff out. So that's where we are right now. Okay, so um, I think in any conversation that's where you're going to anticipate differing views, which we know we will. Um, it's good to start on common ground, because that shows that there is something that you can agree on, and um, it also prevents you from making, I guess, the ad hominem attacks. If you start on common ground, I think that will give you a basis for realizing that the if you have differing conclusions, that it's a difference in logic, progression of logic, rather
Yeah,
than
of
like, oh
the
my gosh, you're a
interpretation.
monster.
Yeah, it's a difference in interpretation based off of those values that you share.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a model that I've come up with to model, be a metaphor for political discussion, and that's a tree. So if you imagine a tree, it has a big tree, lots of leaves, nice big tall thick trunk, and lots of branches, and it's just huge. And so the political discussions that we see on TV are had at the level of the leaves, where there's one leaf that's over here on this side of the tree, and then another leaf, the opposing view, is on over here on way the other side of the tree. And it seems, oh my gosh, how can you ever reconcile these two leaves? They're just opposing each other. um, and so I think that's one of the reasons why, like in watching political debates, uh, it it sort of seems like you're going in circles, and there's no way to reconcile the two unless you come down to, you follow those leaves to the little branches that are sticking out from them, or that they're attached to, and then you follow them to the bigger branches, and then you follow them to the trunk. And so that trunk is where I want to start with you, is to figure out what do we have in common in our assumptions about life, and our philosophies. And I use that word like as a very elegant word for what I actually mean, which is my philosophy. I don't have any training in philosophy. I've never studied philosophy. I've never studied political science. Like I have no accreditation for this. But what I mean by philosophy is just, I had thoughts, and these are my thoughts. um, but so thinking about what philosophies do we have in common, and then following that up and figuring out, okay, where's the first place that our trunk branches off?
Hmm.
Because at some point it branches off, and it leads to me saying I'm going to vote for Trump in 2020, and to you saying I'm going to vote for Joe Biden in 2020. And so rather than just starting from there, let's get down to the roots.
All right, let's do it.
Okay.
Let's dig deep.
All right. So I think in thinking about what my tree trunk looks like, I think the lowest level I could get to boil down my philosophy on life is that absolute objective truth exists.
Um, okay, so can you dig into that a little bit
Yeah,
more?
absolutely. So I guess in order to dig into that a little bit more, I have to define my terms. Like what the heck is truth? What does that mean? And so after thinking about it a little bit more, I think the way that I define truth is that it is the singular reality within which the universe exists and operates. That there is a singular reality. Now, I use the word singular, and I don't mean simple. I mean that there is one, but not that it is simple. I think that our universe is very complicated. The reality that we live in is very complicated.
So what would be a counter example to this? Like, what is the opposite of what you're saying right now?
Well, so I think the reason that I am emphasizing that we start here is that I think in political discussion, especially, it is very easy to fall into this counterexample of what you're saying of that of I don't know if you've ever heard this when talking with someone, of someone saying, oh, okay, well, that's your truth. I think in a way it becomes a cop out. I think truth becomes, in that, truth is getting mixed up with that's your opinion. And it's okay to have differences in opinion. Totally fine. That's going to happen. We're all different.
Mm-hmm.
But there are not differences in truth. Truth is truth. Like that, it is objective. It might not be knowable completely. I don't think there's anyone in the world who knows the absolute objective truth and can encompass it entirely. But that it is out there and it exists. And the reason, I mean, I guess some backing for this claim is that scientific pursuit relies entirely on the existence of truth. So belief, what I am proposing is that belief in science means that you have belief in truth. And that's to say, like, why ask questions of how and why? The questions that we ask in science, why ask those if there is no objective answer? There's no point.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think so. I think I agree with you, but I think one important distinction to make is I think that there's also the fact that as conscious beings, like what we perceive and what we think is our perception of reality. Like there is a reality, there is
Mm-hmm.
like there is a reality that is the same for everyone, but everyone's perception of that reality can be different.
Yeah.
And like, is that
Yeah, I totally agree. And
something?
I think from that difference in perception and difference in experience is birthed difference in opinion.
Yeah. Okay.
What
I
how do
think
you think?
we're on the
Yeah.
same page there.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. We're still at the trunk. Great.
All right. We're not on two different trees. That would be an awkward and shorter conversation.
Yeah.
We're like, all right, well, thank you. Thanks for the conversation. That was
Canceled. Okay, so then the next level up on my trunk, which might turn out to be one of our branches, but we'll see. The next thing that follows from that objective absolute truth exists is that moral law is derived from this absolute objective truth.
okay. So, what do you mean by moral law?
Great question. So again, I have to define my terms. Um, so looking at human nature, thinking about how we're separated from the rest of nature, looking at animals live entirely in instinct. They do not have the capability to seek truth, which I would call the intellect, and they do not have the ability to choose to live outside of truth, which I would call the will. So for example, I was trying to think of examples of this. Like, have you ever seen those videos of dogs who have done something terribly wrong, like torn up all the toilet paper or eaten all the food in the pantry or
Yeah.
something? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I've watched those. I'm a sucker for those, and Facebook knows it, so I get those a lot on my feed. But if you think about it, like in watching those videos, usually from the videos that I've seen, there's one dog that if there are two dogs, one dog has done the crime, the other has not. There's one dog who's just sort of looking at the person who's filming, like, hi human. And then there's the other dog that has done the crime and is like, oh my gosh, what have I done? The ears are down and looking downcast, very guilty. So
Mm-hmm.
like that dog is living, it has no choice but to live in that truth that, yeah, I screwed up. Whereas like if it were a little kid say it's a little kid who ate a cookie, and she wasn't supposed to, and the mom is like videotaping her and saying, well, did you eat the cookie? And the little kid is, looking around and very obviously lying. She says no. It has
Mhm.
cookie crumbs on the side of her mouth. So I mean, I think that the moral law then, so if humans have this ability that animals do not, the ability of the intellect and the will, the ability to seek the truth and the ability to choose to live within or without the truth, then moral law is the obligation to live according to absolute truth to the extent that our intellect is able to discover it. So yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so is your kind of implied in that statement is that you think that humans um, are distinct from any other animal in this sense?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes. Yeah. And
so
I guess that's the interim
okay,
between.
I guess this is like one of the we're getting to like my tree trunk, right? So,
Yeah, sure.
do you believe in evolution?
Yes.
Okay, so if we look at evolution, right?
Mhm.
So humans, there was at some point we descended from like apes, chimpanzees, then we got to like Neanderthals, and sort of
Mhm.
this like gradual, and it's not like even though we see on a evolutionary tree, we see like these branches, um,
Mhm.
like by the nature of biological process, like everything is just like over time, just like very small changes one at a time, right?
Mhm.
Like we
Mhm.
slowly evolve like generation over generation. Um, and like I guess we don't have any living Neanderthals or like close relatives, but if we do look at some gorillas and apes and
Mhm.
chimpanzees, they have this a pretty phenomenal ability and pretty phenomenal intellect. Like there are
Mhm.
um, there's stories of these chimpanzees and or these I think there's a gorilla. It's been a while since I read this story, but they were trained with a teacher for many years, and they were able to feel like they were able to learn. They were able to like pick up intellectual skills. They were able to feel remorse. They were able to feel like sadness when
Mhm.
their owner
Mhm.
died. Um,
Mhm.
like a lot of very similar emotions, and I would say
Mhm.
I would ask you, like, is there a line between, like, all right, this is a human, and this was when intellect and will came about as like this thing that was granted to them?
Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
Great question. Um, Scientifically, I could be totally full of it, so I don't know. Um, but my guess is, I mean, what I believe is that Homo sapiens, like, boom, that is when, who knows about Neanderthals? But I think there is something different about Homo sapiens. We are still yet more evolved in these cognitive functions than chimpanzees or our closest primate relatives. Uh, in that we're able to discuss these questions of like politics. We're able to form governments and form laws and discuss morality and have create music, write literature, be creative. And I think I agree that especially in like the last, I don't know, 200 years or so, we've really realized, my gosh, you know, animals do have quite potential for like emotional, for what I would call emotional instincts, and also the ability to learn. I think that um, I've seen videos of chimpanzees using tools, which previously we used to think, oh, that's the one thing that separates us from man from apes. But no, I mean, they can use tools. They can learn how to use tools and learn how to do that. Though I think there is still one very definite distinction between man and any other primate, is that we're able to um, really, well, I guess, choose to not be, this is gonna sound bad, but a slave to instinct. Um, I don't mean to be derogatory to
No, no,
chimpanzees.
that I mean, I think we're in agreement that I mean, there's
Um,
obviously a distinction between humans and the rest
right.
of the animal kingdom, right? I
Hmm.
think that um, like there's a really good book on this called *Sapiens*, which is like
Oh.
the
Hmm.
history of like human like sapiens, Homo sapiens, but
Uh-huh.
like it seems like we reached this point where like we evolved the species that had this distinct advantage. Like they did have increased cognitive abilities, so they could plan. I think the big thing was um, kind of the difference of why Homo sapiens could take over the world is that they were able to start scaling by
Oh.
creating stories, by saying like instead of just having a small tribe and just only being able to communicate with whoever's in you, like the ability to convince like a city, a town, like an entire army to
Mm,
follow and pursue something like a religion or like a government or under
right.
some king. And like I think the ability to tell stories and have like that enhanced cognitive ability.
Mhm.
I would argue that there are, in some ways, like if we just look at addictions and bad habits, and there are a lot of like there are a lot of signs that we are animals still, right? Like we
I
do,
totally agree. Yeah,
like we are, um, yeah, we are sometimes I think slaves to our own instincts and our habits, and like the like
absolutely.
anytime you eat junk food or indulge or you like watch like you spend like tons of time on social media and you're like, why did I just do that? It's like that's the dopamine system that was
Yeah,
evolved from our ancestors. um, so I think that there's definitely traces of that in us.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
I totally agree. And I think oftentimes that is that slave to instinct, that urge to follow our instinct, um, is what leads us against moral law. Um, is that like say um, you've got this big work project that you've got coming up, and it you know morally, you should work on it. You have an obligation to your employer, to your company, to the people who you serve, to meet this project deadline. But if you waste your time on social media, then because it feels good, then that's a moral failing in a way.
So
So
would you say that that only applies to humans then? Like if a chimpanzee were to follow their instinct and like I don't know waste time, is
like
that
the rat, the little rat that clicks the dopamine
yeah,
thing,
something
the
like that?
receptor, yeah, the
Like,
button.
is that a,
Mhm.
would you consider that a moral failing?
No, I don't think that, because I don't believe that they have the capability of of living beyond their instincts, their animal instincts. They don't have the obligation to. Sort of like a little kid who doesn't know the difference between, I don't know. Shoot, I'm trying to think of some big, uh, like a little kid who chooses to. Have you seen those videos on um, the delayed response, delayed gratification of little kids who get like little
Yeah, yeah.
candies in front
The
of them?
marshmallow experiment.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, I think there's certain, as little kids develop their intellectual abilities, and they develop their conscience, and they develop their just their cognitive abilities, they become more responsible, which is one reason why we try criminals differently if they're an adult versus if they're a child, right? That you have differing levels of abilities to discern what is right and what is wrong, and the ability to quiet those animal instincts versus not.
Yeah. Okay. So so sorry, I have another question about so okay, so moral law. You
Sure.
said that essentially with it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying that because we have the capability
Mm-hmm.
to and awareness
Mm-hmm.
of what is right and what is wrong,
Uh-huh.
um, or not even what is right or what is wrong necessarily, but like the ability and awareness of, you know, of like this is an instinct, an animal instinct, versus this is what will generally lead to more happiness in my experience. In you're saying that with that comes responsibility and not obligation. So how does that become like an obligation? Like where does the like why is there an obligation, and like how does that conferred on humans?
Good question. So I think, well, I think that's probably my next assumption then, is that because there is absolute truth, and let me know if I'm like not right, answering your question right. If there is absolute truth, and and that we derive moral law from that, I guess your question is why is there moral law derived
Yeah,
from absolute?
why does there have to be moral law derived from, like, we have this absolute truth? It seems
Mhm.
like moral law you're describing is not absolute necessarily. Like this seems like how can there be an absolute moral law derived from, like, there is an absolute truth, but then how do you derive something that is also absolute from that?
So I don't know if this is what you're getting at, but so I don't mean by absolute, I don't mean cookie cutter. Like there, for example, murder or
Mhm.
killing someone. If I were walking down the street and I just saw a random person and I stabbed him and killed him, that's murder, hands down. No one's going to argue with that. If I'm walking down the street and I get attacked and like they start strangling me, and as a resort to protect my life, I stab them, and I stab a person, and he ends up dying. Then that, although the end is still the person has died, it is not, in our society, it is not considered murder uh, because of these other circumstances. So that, I guess that's to say that this moral law, um, there of course variables um, that will affect whether or not something is considered moral or immoral. And it could be, although the outcome is the same, it could be a different um, it could be a different uh, moral or immoral ruling based on the variables that were involved. Is that, I don't
Okay.
know if that's really answering your question.
So maybe my to distill the question, make it more specific. Do you
Yeah.
think, like, when you say that you think there's a moral law, do you think that there's like an absolute right and wrong?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Very good question. Yeah. And I think the ability to say something is right or wrong is also entirely based off of the existence of truth. You can't say to someone, that's wrong to do unless there is a right thing to do. And um, one the existence of one makes necessary the existence of the other. Um,
Okay. So so I guess, like, what would you say in, like, there's all these moral thought experiments, right? Where you have a train that's going down a track and it's going to hit someone. Have you heard of these? Something like this?
I think so, but keep on going, keep
Okay,
going.
so there's a train headed for uh, one person, right?
Right.
And if you, or let's say there's a train headed for 10 people, they're tied on the railroad track. You have the opportunity to push the lever, and
Mhm.
then it will direct the train to this other one single person. And so you pull the trigger, it kills one person instead of 10 people.
Right.
Um, so what is the absolute right and wrong in that situation?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, personally, what I say, I mean, loss of life is undesirable. So if you can minimize loss of life, then that I would minimize it. But I mean, that's just talking about this example. But in a wider application of this moral law derived from absolute truth, uh, I would say that there is one right way, but because we are limited beings, because we can't we're limited by number one, like in this situation, time. We're limited by our emotional response, the stress level. We might not make the best decision in that time. Because we're limited beings, we can't encompass all of the variables that might go into a moral decision. So the fact that there's absolute truth, in this definition for moral law, I say it's the obligation to live according to absolute truth to the extent that our intellect is able to discover. So really, that's to say we got to do the best we can. Like, there is a right answer and there is a wrong answer, and as long as we try to reach the right answer, then we did our due diligence, and as long as we made a sincere effort to seek out what is the truth, what is the right answer here, and then we act according to it, then we fulfilled our obligation.
Okay, cool. I think I kind of understand where you're coming from. I might, and I do think it would be valuable to move on to our actual like the political discussion eventually. But I would say that we do. So I think the part that I might disagree with you is, you say that there's an absolute truth, and so based on that, there is also an absolute right or wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm not necessarily sure if that has to be true. So like I think that there can be an absolute truth, like there is reality, there is a truth,
Mm-hmm.
but that reality doesn't, like, right or wrong is a concept, like that is not necessarily, like I don't
Okay.
necessarily think that has to be present in whatever reality is.
Right. And so I think the way in which I'm defining right or wrong, I wonder if this is sort of what you're getting at. Um, this might not be helpful, but the way that I define right or wrong in this is a thing that is right is something that is congruent. Is that the right word? Congruent with truth. And a thing that is wrong is something that is outside of that truth.
So okay, so you're just to rephrase. So you're saying that the truth, something that is right is congruent with truth. Something that is wrong is incongruent with truth.
Yes.
What is congruent? Like, what do you mean by congruent in that case? Like, because when I think of truth, I think of like this is the way things are.
Mm-hmm.
We have, this train is rolling down the tracks, and there are these atoms moving through space. There is matter here, and I have like a process. I have neurons firing and like moving around and creating these thoughts that I don't have, like, not aware of. Like there's sun, like photons coming in, like, and something happens. Like I am triggered to do something. There's stimulus that causes me to do something. Like that is the truth. So like no matter what I do, like that is, I guess, everything. I guess what I'm saying is like everything that happens is congruent with truth, because my definition of truth is just like this is what things are. Like this is
Mm-hmm. Right.
the way things are. Yeah.
Yeah, so good question. I think that there are scientific truths. So like the photons and the like everything physical, in the physical environment, in the physical universe, that is a very easy, I think, truth to accept. I think there are also humanistic truths that are more what's the word, that are more abstract. So, what's an example of a humanistic truth? Um, I mean, one thing that I would say is a humanistic truth is that as humans, each and every one of us are unified by the desire for happiness. We all seek happiness, and even in some sad cases of suicide, suicide is seen as by a suicidal person a way, well, maybe if I can just escape life, then it'll relieve this unhappiness that I feel. And so suicide in a way is trying to to find more happiness. So I think that there are humanistic truths that inform moral law. And
Well, I think that even with that example, like,
mm-hmm.
I think that I don't know if I would call that a truth, because you can perceive that in many ways. Like, for the person who commits suicide, they could not be pursuing happiness, but they're trying to avoid pain, right? They're trying
Mm-hmm.
to avoid suffering. And I think that those are two different, like, concepts. Like, one person who's pursuing happiness versus one person who's trying to just get rid of suffering. So when you say, like, humanistic truth,
Yeah.
like, do you mean that that's like a moral, that's like an absolute truth, or what
Um
is a humanistic truth, I guess?
yeah, so I guess I used humanistic to differentiate from scientific truth. So like you were talking before about the photons from the sun and the impulses that you have in your brain when the train is coming. You know, those are very easily like through the scientific method you can measure those. Those are quantifiable. But I think, you know, we as humans again have this capacity for abstract thought, and so because of that there's this ability to perceive abstract truth as well. um and so I mean, I think there are some things that and I guess one another word for them that I would use is, I guess, is assumptions. So there are some things that I have as base assumptions as being true. So for one, being like this pursuit of happiness, people want to be happy um, in life. No one seeks unhappiness. Um, like if you're moping and you like sometimes if you're in a fight or you're sulking or something, that can be thought as seeking unhappiness, but you're actually deriving pleasure in that moment from being unhappy. So in a way, you're still seeking happiness. Um,
Okay, so maybe do you think there's a distinction between, like, I think there's the absolute truth, right? Where we said, like, this is
mhm,
like what is real and what is
mhm,
true. And then I think humanistic truth is like, it requires the human, like, ability to think abstractly, right? Like, it does
mhm,
require, like, your ability to reason.
mhm.
And in that sense, it is not an absolute across everyone anymore. Like, this is where I think it comes in, where, like, your experiences, your genetics, like, your, you know, brain chemistry, and, like, your thoughts and your background might make that a conclusion you come to as your truth, and then someone else may think differently. Like, is that something that you accept, or do you think that
Um,
humanistic truths are also absolute?
I think I think that I do think that humanistic truths are still absolute because that still serves as the basis for any moral argument. That you know, if there is no absolute humanistic truth, if there is no absolute morality, then how can we make any laws for morality? Um, how can a society deem any one thing moral or immoral? Um,
Yeah, and actually, I not to like, we could probably have a separate conversation about free will here, but
uh,
um I mean, like, one of the concepts that I have sort of resonated with is this
uh,
idea that there is no such thing as free will, in a sense, and that um, the fact that you can kind of model, hypothetically, if you could model all the atoms in the universe, and sort of turn these into a simulation where you could predict, like, what's going to happen next, because everything, even though it seems like it's coming from, like, our human spirit, or our, like, our drive, it in reality, it's like there is something that happens in our brain, right? It's unless you think that there's some, like higher, like a soul or something that we don't understand. But if you do assume that it, like, we are like composed of, you know, material, and we, you know, follow all the cause and effect dynamics, like there is something that happens in the brain that creates a thought, and that thought compels us to do something. And in that sense, like if we think about it that way, I don't know if it's something that I've thought about a lot. But
Mhm.
like one thing that I really do agree with is that in the criminal justice system, it means that it actually doesn't make sense to punish someone because they're wrong, punish them for the sake of, because they're a bad person. Because essentially what this is saying is that that person didn't have a choice, in the, not in the sense of like they made this choice, but in the sense that if you converted all of your atoms in your entire being to that person when they were, you know, 5 years old, 10 years old, however old they are, then you would have done the exact same things. You probably would have done the exact same things, because like that is just how the, like the model and the simulation was going to go. Now, I don't know if I agree completely with that argument, but it's it definitely has influenced my thinking about it in some way.
Mhm.
Of like,
Mhm.
for the criminal justice system, you were saying like how, if we don't have an absolute right or wrong, how could we decide what's right or wrong? And my answer is actually like maybe we can't, and like maybe, so I think that the purpose of a criminal justice system and for prisons would be to protect the rest of society. I do think that there is, um, and maybe I'm talking in circles now, because like I do think that, you know, as society there is an obligation, or there is, you know, there is something like there is something that we obviously work towards and that we try to find meaning in. But on the individual side, like I would say like maybe it doesn't make sense to punish this individual for the sake of punishment because they're evil, but we should keep them in prison. But prison is still could be a valuable tool to protect the rest of society from a dangerous person, but not thinking of it as like this person had a choice and they chose wrong. If that makes sense. This is kind of a long tangent. I don't know if you if there are any
No, no,
questions.
no. I think I follow. Um, and I think, I mean, I think you summed it up pretty well in the fact that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that, you know, I guess in what you're saying is that humans are a summation of all of the uh, environmental stimuli that we've received, and the chemistry of our brains and the chemistry of our bodies, and that uh, our actions are entirely results of those reactions
Mhm.
of the environmental stimuli of our bodies. Um, is that's
Yeah.
and so
So
because of that, it sort of it negates the idea of choice, of free
yeah,
will.
and so I think that I might not have been really precise in where I was going with that. So I
Yeah.
think thinking about it over again, I think that is an argument for there may not be such thing as an evil person versus a good person,
Mm-hmm.
but there is still such thing as a good and a bad, and there is such thing as like as a right or wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But I I'm not sure if, like, I think that as humans um like we work towards that, right? Like we try to find meaning in like one of the fundamental truths that I sort of thought about is like, you know, reducing suffering. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
it's sort of like yours, maybe just spun differently, but just like reducing suffering seems to be, um and actually this is something I heard from Jordan Peterson, who,
Mm-hmm.
which I really appreciated the way he put it, is like, how do you find meaning? And he actually argues that it is very hard to find meaning by, like, from the direct way. But what he argues is that, like, if you read about the Holocaust, or if you read about these just atrocities, like, just go figure out what is like the worst, like hell, right? What is the worst um, thing that just like makes you feel like this is just totally wrong, and then just
Mhm.
move in the opposite direction of that is like that is the right. Like, how do you find what is like good, I guess. And I don't know if like, because, and maybe this is what you mean by humanistic truth, but like maybe the fact that humans can recognize this is really wrong and this is really right, then maybe that you're saying like there's an obligation for humans to follow what is good and follow what is right.
Yes,
Are we maybe that was a long-winded way of saying like, all right, we're kind of, does that
I
like,
think so. I think we're on the same page that like, well, I think you definitely at least follow me. I don't know if you entirely agree with me from what you were saying as far as like the question of whether or not will exists. Um,
yeah, and that was, and that's not like a strong opinion I hold. I think that
okay,
is just that, but a lot of points in that argument make sense to me. But I think we have, I think we have enough to go on to the
to
next
continue.
branch. Okay.
Okay, so next one. Uh, after next part of my trunk.
Mhm.
After we've got absolute truth exists, moral law is derived from this absolute truth. Next part, I think this is like probably the last part of my tree trunk. Is civil law should be formed to reflect moral law.
Yeah, I think that that makes sense. If like maybe, since like the concept of moral law, I think the it maybe in my wording it would be, if we can, like as humans, it is like it should be our duty to try to form laws, like civil laws,
Mm-hmm.
that um, maximize the good and as to the best of our ability.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Um,
You put that beautifully, much more beautifully than I did in all my notes that I was trying to boil it down.
okay. Um, cool. But I think the important point to note there is that
Mhm.
um, we may, and this is probably where we climb up higher the tree, but
Right.
um, yeah, like there are different opinions for how to go about that, and that reflects the fact that
Absolutely.
different people may have different views of what the moral law is, right? Like, because
Exactly.
interpret like we don't know, like people might have different interpretations of what is right or wrong.
Yeah, 100% agree. And actually,
Okay.
that's a perfect segue. So now I'm gonna use another metaphor, an issue that I'm not really a political issue that I'm not really going to focus on besides giving this example. But so for example, the idea of when the application when this application of these truths really differ, and that's when you get all the branches and all the different political opinions. So um, I think one thing that most Americans would agree on is that one truth, one humanistic truth, let's say, is that if you work hard for something, then you should enjoy the benefits of it. And so there are many different applications of this. So, for example, two very differing from two different political parties, the application of this that is commonly found in more liberal circles is if I work hard, then I should be paid a fair wage. So that's where we get minimum wage for. And then a more conservative application of this is, well, if I work hard, then I shouldn't be taxed on it. So decrease taxes. But they all, come from the same value of, listen, I worked hard for this. I deserve it.
Yeah,
And
actually, so that might be how the division goes amongst a lot of Republicans and Democrats. I would actually argue, I'm going to bring in the free will argument again. So I would actually say like another potential view is that is not that I worked hard and I deserve it, but that if you have enjoyed successes, that so much of that is based on luck. And so much of that
Mhm,
is not
mhm.
based on hard work and that you deserve it, but based off of like you didn't choose where you were born, like what kind of like environment you grew up in, whether or not you had trauma or things that happened to you in the way, and that because of that, I think that there's the argument that like I could also see the 15 wage minimum an hour or $15 minimum wage come from the fact that like if you're enjoying successes, a lot of that is coming from good fortune. And if
Mm-hmm.
you're down in like, the dumps, a lot of that's just because you're unlucky. And
Yeah,
we really could have been born in either way. And so that
absolutely.
we should give everybody a floor to stand on because of
Mm-hmm.
that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I, sorry, that not to derail, but
No, you're good. You're good.
I wanted to throw that in
But
there.
I think in using that as a demonstration of, um, you know, trying to demonstrate that there are values that I think a lot of Americans hold in common, but the application of them is that this is the branches. We're now in the branches, and this is where the applications will get a little more hairy.
Sure.
So now that we are getting to the branches, let me just start introducing this idea now of real life. How does this apply to everything now? So let me say, this podcast is giving me the opportunity to sort of explain how I came to the conclusion of I should vote for Trump in 2020. Some background: I did not vote for Trump in 2016. I thought there was no way that he could win in 2016. I sort of thought it was a joke, and was very, very, very surprised and kind of scared in 2016 when he did win. So, because he sort of shattered all of my assumptions of what a politician, of what the president of the United States is, and I think the first of that being, is a career politician. And so,
And would you mind sharing, did you vote for Hillary or did you not vote that year?
no, I actually I voted for a fill-in candidate.
Okay.
Yeah. And so that year I was like, well, I don't want to vote for Trump. I don't want to vote for Hillary. I'm going to use my vote to express my, try to find a candidate who is most in line with what I believe. And, I can't even remember the guy's name, honestly. Like, clearly nothing ever came of it. So, in a way, and I think that's one thing that sort of has influenced this upcoming election for me, is that I feel like I really threw away my vote. And I think a lot of voting these days, especially with this two-party system, is like, well, I've got to vote for this person because then at least it's not a vote for the other person, rather than I'm voting for this person because I am totally behind everything they do and everything they stand for.
Yeah.
And it's an unfortunate consequence of
Yeah.
how
So,
our system's set up.
so I might ask, like, since if listeners have been listening this far, it probably feels like this like suspense novel that's you don't get like the answer until the very end.
Yeah,
I'm
no, that's
hoping, like, I
exactly
was
how it's
wondering
going
if
to
we
be.
could just give like a really quick, like, rapid fire answer to, like, so if when you're voting for Trump, because you'd mentioned one of the reasons of you wanted your vote to count, are you like, is this like voting for Trump, is it more of a you're like enthusiastically supporting him, or you think he's the lesser of two evils? What's your
No,
attitude?
yeah, good question. So I think in the last 4 years, I have become a bless you, a fan of what he has done in one area.